Fight.
On today's podcast, we're going to talk after a couple of weeks off here to get kind of things rolling, watching games throughout the season. And we're going to talk about the NCAA men's basketball. We're going to call them the State of North Carolina Power Rankings. I've watched a lot of the now 19 Division I schools in North Carolina, and I feel like I've put together a good census or a good basis of what's going on. So just want to talk through that. I think it's a fun little addition there. I know it could probably be an article, but I want to get a good pot out here for you guys. And before we jump into that, the NCAA men's basketball State of North Carolina power ranking, just want to mention that SeatGeek is the presenting sponsor of the Two Pointers podcast once again this season. We greatly appreciate their support, whether it's sporting events, concerts, whatever you're heading to this winter here with football, basketball, again, concert sporting events. We want to mention that SeatGeek has a $20 off promo purchase for you. Code 2Pointers, $20 off your first purchase. Link in the top of the description. That will earn you an extra discount as well as it helps support the show as well. So big thank you to SeatGeek and their continued sponsorship and support of what we do around here at the Two Pointers podcast. So the D1 Hoops power ranking is simple. I did this with the games through early this week. I'm recording this on late on the 20th, and so kind of just touching on most of these teams have played 3 to 4, some of them 5 games. So you have a good census of kind of the early non-con. Some teams have played a lot harder schedules, and I did weigh that a little bit more. So number 1, I have Duke. That should come to probably no surprise to anybody because a lot of the top teams in North Carolina, the ones that are undefeated, are ones that have played, let's say, games that are not exactly going to help their net rating or results that are probably not going to help that as well. At least some of these schools at the top have played hard games and they've competed in those games. And I think that really matters. So for Duke, I mean, look, they beat Maine 96-62. They beat Army 100-58. They absolutely ran over Army. Of course, in the Champions Classic, they lost 77-72 against Kentucky. That first half was probably the best half of basketball I've seen any team play this year with Duke. And obviously, the 3-ball did not carry over into the second half like it probably, definitely now we know because of the result that it needed to beat a team like Kentucky that's really experienced, a team that I'm starting to like a lot more. But they lost by 5, right, in a neutral site. So as awesome as I think Kentucky can be, I still think this is a top 5, team in the country, Duke, whenever they're playing really well and they're healthy. And at the end of the day, so far, that ranking 12 in the AP right now, I had them, somewhere in the mid and somewhere right at 10, I believe, either 9 or 10. But the point being is it's less about the ranking. It's about who they've played. And they've played a bunch of teams that beat Wofford 86-35, right? They played a bunch of teams that they can absolutely kill and play Kentucky really close. And I have to, my preconceived notion of them is a little bit still there, but that's early on in the season. You're still going to have that. They play Arizona and Kansas next at Arizona. And then Kansas, I believe, is a home game. It may be semi-neutral, but I have to look at the schedule there. But at the end of the day, Duke is a well-built team, top to bottom. That's really the basis of how early all this is, right? 4 games. They play a really close Kentucky team. I still think they're one of the best teams in the country. And for context, that game against Kansas is part of the Vegas showdown, the Terry's Chocolate Vegas showdown. So neutral, it's going to be in Vegas on November 26th as part of Feast Week. So now that we've gone over Duke, let's talk about their obviously bitter rival, North Carolina. I have them at number 2 for a lot of the same reasons. They've only played 3 games so far. They played Kansas. I say close. The final score was 92-89. Before that, Elon actually gave them a heck of a game out of the CAA. We'll talk about them here in a little bit. And then they beat American, who's projected to be one of the best teams in the Patriot League. So this isn't like an American team that, American didn't just roll over despite the score, 107-55. And then their next game, they play at Hawaii at 12:30 a.m. Eastern on the 23rd. That should be really fun game. And then obviously I mentioned the Kansas game at Kansas. So a true road game at Allen Fieldhouse. Look, that's the hardest, if arguably the hardest place to play in the country at any level against any team of any caliber. And they were down big. claw their way back. It's an impressive performance from a team that, there's some spots that I have big major concerns about, specifically being the big spot and what they do there and how deep they might be. But the guards have been incredible. Godot and Davis have been able to play really well. Trimble had a huge second half in that game, and he was a big reason that Carolina was able to get back into it. Again, preconceived notion for a lot of these teams. This is early on. We're still figuring things out. I understand. But North Carolina, they're 10 in the AP right now. Their next couple of games, they play at Hawaii, like I mentioned, Dayton. They play Alabama at home. That is part of the ACC SEC Challenge. And then they play Georgia Tech, LaSalle, Florida, UCLA, Campbell before they get into conference play at Louisville. So we'll learn a lot more about the Tar Heels here in a couple of weeks. Third, I almost changed this last minute just because of the recent outings and just playing with their food. But Wake Forest, I still believe, again, this early, I'm allowed to kind of keep some of the biases into these thoughts and these opinions. But at the end of the day, this Wake Forest team is really good, and they'll end up being really good. I'm not worried about these results as much, but you do have to go out and put your foot down, and you got to beat Florida. You got to beat Texas A&M at Texas A&M. You got to beat Boston College, James Madison, Clemson. You got to start getting these wins and stringing them together, and confidently and convincingly. Coppin State, NCAA, these are all home games. Michigan is they call that, I think Kim Plum calls it a semi-home. They played that at Greensboro. That was like right down the road, nowhere near Michigan. So that was a home game for them at Greensboro Coliseum, 72-70. I think it's a big win. I think that win will age well. Michigan might be a little bit better than I think. USC Upstate has given like every team in the ACC a hard-fought battle. Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, NC State. The closest of those, unfortunately, in this case being Wake, but I still think Wake's their best team in the state of North Carolina. That loss at Xavier, I think, will age really poorly. I think Xavier's really good. 75-60. They learned a lot about themselves. I think the Omaha Blue entry is going to hurt them for a really long time because his projected return is like January. And at the end of the day, that big spot, you're really relying on Spillers. You're really relying on Reed. But they'll figure things out, right? Parker Frederickson's not going to shoot, whatever he's shooting, an ungodly career low. That's not going to continue, and it didn't. He shot really well against Western Carolina, I believe. So, Salas had 20. Hildreth had 18 and 6 after a terrible showing against Xavier. They're figuring things out. Again, I think this stretch here, you played Detroit Mercy before you have a rematch with Florida. They played Florida last year at the Joel. This one is not at home. And then you have Texas A&M, like I said, on the road, true road game before you come home for a little while again. And then you play at Clemson, at Syracuse to open up the conference slate there in the new year. Again, still Wake Forest being the third best team. I'm not backing down from that. A lot of my eggs, I joked early on in the season, I kept making this point, but all my eggs are in the Wake Forest basket. And early on, until they completely show me they've collapsed, I know that Xavier's good. Like that's not a win I'm not gonna cry about for further where I think they rank. Next is a team I've gotten to see play in person actually this year in their biggest game to date. That is High Point. I have High Point, the undefeated Panthers. I have them at 5-0, and I have them fourth in the state of North Carolina because of their schedule. They beat Coppin State, Jackson State, and NC Central. These are all games at home to open the season. Nobody wanted to play them. Nobody wanted to schedule them. So this is all a testament to them getting these games, paying for them, and winning them. UAB was the game I was at, 68-65. If it wasn't for Ante Berzovic and Charleston and FAU and double overtime at TD Arena and a running buzzer beater by Berzovic, this could have been the game of that day. 68-65 is still one of the best mid-major games of the season so far and probably will age really well. High Point won the game, mucking it up, right? They won the game where UAB likes to typically succeed and get games really gross, get games really kind of down into the weeds. And that's a game that High Point wants to spread out and score and shoot the ball and play fast. And they weren't able to do that. And they still won. Like, that's a huge testament to what Coach Huss is building down there at High Point in just year two after winning 30 games last year. They play Missouri State, Pfeiffer, and then they go at UNC Greensboro, home against North Texas. App State, I believe, is a neutral site. They play a non-Division I at Southern Illinois, They play these tough games, and then they finally on January 2nd play Radford at home to open up the slate. Before I think the Big South's going to be really good. They play a decent slate here. We'll get to some of these teams: UNC, Asheville, Gardner Webb, etc. They're going to be able to get that figured out. And I'm not going to sit here and continuously beat a dead horse, but there's not many games left that they can lose. They can definitely lose to North Texas. They can definitely lose to UNC Greensboro. If they get into conference play undefeated, there may not be a team in front of them that they can lose to. Again, don't want to jinx them, but I really believe it. I saw this team play; they're incredible. Number 5, I have NC State. NC State, very famously, has always played lower Division I competition. If not, I think there isn't a lot of non D1 in recent years. But after last year's run to the Final Four, how incredible that team was. You have a lot to prove. You have a lot to come out and get figured out without DJ Burns and without DJ Horn. But you have a good group of returning guys, and you have to go out and you have to beat teams convincingly. And for the most part, they've done that. I mentioned Upstate. That was 97-66 to open the year. They beat Presbyterian, so they beat 2 Big South teams. They beat Coastal Carolina, who 92-70 is going to, or 82-70, excuse me, a 12-point win. All these games are at Lenovo Center here in Raleigh. Coastal Carolina, I think tough team under Justin Gray. I don't think they're going to be blowing the doors off anybody in the Sun Belt, but I don't think they're going to be a doormat either. And then Colgate, 72-49. They've got an incredible program there. In Colgate, multiple NCAA tournament appearances in the last 10 years. Just an incredibly well-built program. 72-49. They play William and Mary, and then this is where NC State starts to figure out and kind of learn a lot about themselves. On the 28th of November, they play Purdue. They play Texas on the 4th of December. A couple of Florida State, Coppin State games they can win, and then they play at Kansas. At Kansas on December 14th. That is a team that will know a lot about themselves as we head into the week of Christmas there. But overall, the transfers are starting to kind of really get their footing on things. Marcus Hill, 17 in the win against Colgate. I think he's becoming arguably their most important piece so far. Brandon Huntley Hatfield, I think, will end up being kind of the most impactful ceiling raiser for them. Middlebrooks has continued to step into some great roles. Jaden Taylor obviously is going to have the ball a ton. These guys are they need to learn to continue to play together, how to figure that out, play deep, play fast, and defend really, really well. And I think that they can, if they can go 2-1 in the Purdue, Texas, and Kansas games, the season starts to look a whole lot more promising and quickly. As like I said, heading into the week of Christmas, there they play Ryder on the 22nd. So NC State I have at number 5. Number 6 might surprise people, but they're one of the best stories, in mid-major college basketball right now, and that's East Carolina, historically known to most folks outside of the state of North Carolina, really ever, as a football school, and they've kind of got some interesting things going on in football there. But they're 4-0, sneakily, beating some decent teams here. Obviously, I say decent teams in this case. Coastal Carolina 63-59. George Mason, they beat by 1. George Mason, you just never know. A10, Tony Skin there, I believe in that program, and I believe in him. But they, a lot of head-to-heads in the non-con. You'll see with the trend here with some of these schools we'll get to. They play a lot of in-state schools in a couple of weeks. They play Gardner Webb in the non-con. They play UNCW. They play A&T. You're going to start to that would have probably made this ranking a little easier. Maybe we'll readdress this in a few months. But they're 4-0. That's one of the best starts in recent program history. I really believe in Coach Schwartz, the defense, the idea of what this team can be with RJ Felton. Felton's an incredible player. He had 27 points in their double overtime win against George Mason. They've got some spectacular plays that made it on the Sports Center with Jordan Riley and those athletic dunks. They've got a lot of soul searching to do when it comes to the front court, but I do think the back court and Felton leading the way. He'll be one of the best players in the American this year, arguably a first-team all AAC player. They play Jacksonville State, like I said, A&T, Wilmington at South Carolina. That should be a really interesting game. South Carolina is not as good as they were last year. North Alabama might be one of the hardest teams on their schedule for a few weeks here. FIU at home. They get Gardner Webb at home. At South Florida is when they begin the American slate on Christmas Eve on the 31st. But I really like East Carolina. Really fun story. All these rankings are irrelevant. These teams play 4 games. Ultimately, these will age, differently, poorly for some. But East Carolina is a great story, which is why I have them at number 6. We'll start to roll through these a little bit. UNC Wilmington is who I have at number 7. And Seahawk fans, before you come and attack me, right? Obviously, you have a loss on your schedule, and obviously, I understand it's against Kansas. I'm very well aware of that. But you beat a non-D1 Georgia Southern, who I think is a feisty team. Upstate was a close win. I know that was at Upstate, who's just, like I said earlier, giving me USC Upstate. Shock of the season so far, with having, I believe they returned 0% of their minutes. So a lot going on there. I believe, if I remember correctly, I wrote for them in the Big South now. It's evading me, but I'm pretty sure they don't have a single Division I minute either from last year. At Upstate, true road game, win by 5 or 4, excuse me. And then at Kansas, 84-66. That game was really tough in the first half. I think that was a really valiant fight from TKO, but he can also use this game incredibly well, I think, for his team. Really nice stretch here coming up for UNCW. They have a MTE coming up with Colgate, Sam Houston, and App State before they play at East Carolina, home against Marshall, at Howard, and then Florida Gulf Coast, UNC Asheville, non-D1, and then they begin with a really tough stretch in conference play, home against Towson, home against Campbell, at Monmouth, and at Hofstra to open the first 4 games of CAA play. UNCW will always be really good under Takeo Sato. I will never doubt that in any frame or fashion. They went out and they got the most home games in program history. That's a credit to the athletic department and how they want to build that program. And I think all of these games at Kansas, right, this home tournament that you have here at East Carolina, these are all games that are going to build this program up in the short term and also in the long term. Just continue to buy those games, continue to play them, continue to compete in them and win them. We saw them go to Kentucky last year and won in Rupp. I mean, that's a feat that not many people have done in this century, for crying out loud, right? But UNCW, they'll be really good this year. I really like what I've seen from just the transfer guards and just how those guys have continued to gel that quickly. I also like what I've seen from Kamari, and I think his development is going to be really important for their team in the front court. Next, we have Davidson. Davidson, who has played a relatively tough schedule to start the year. Davidson, obviously famously known, for having Steph Curry, of course, but in recent years, they've also had some really competitive teams in the A10. They're 3-0. They beat a non-D1. They've won at Bowling Green, and they beat East Tennessee State, who's going to be one of the best teams in the SoCon, and an incredibly coached team as well. So Davidson, the stretch for Davidson where they're really going to have to figure things out is going to be VMI, Arizona, Charleston, Southern, Charlotte. Those 4 right there against some really tough teams. Obviously, Arizona is kind of the highlight there. Charleston Southern had a really tough game the other day. VMI and Charlotte are all teams that are very competitive in their conference, at least in recent years. Davidson's led by 4 double-digit scorers. They're one of the best offensive teams in the country, really. I mean, they're top 100 in offensive efficiency, and that right now is something that they can kind of build upon with Connor Kuchera, Reed Bailey, Bobby Durkin, and Zach LaPut all scoring over 11 points per game. So they obviously are going to have a tough schedule here coming up when you're the A10, the teams that can afford, like I said, with the VMI, Arizona, Charleston Southern, Charlotte, they're going to play a lot of those tough games there. A lot of those teams are in the top 150 in KenPom. But then, A10 play, regardless of what people think of the preconceived notions coming into the season with how many bids and Dayton and this and that, their first couple of games, they have Duquesne, Fordham, and then LaSalle 121, Rhode Island 108. This is a KenPom rating. St. Joseph's 103, Richmond 213, George Mason's 89, Dayton's 39. So they play some really tough games in their schedule. A lot of their hardest games are actually to end the year. They play in a matter of a few weeks. They play Loyola Chicago, Fordham, St. Louis, VCU, Loyola Chicago, and St. Bonaventure to end the year. So Davidson 3-0 right now. Really cool story. Top 100 in KenPom offense is something to keep an eye on. Next team we have is Charlotte. Charlotte of course, under second-year head coach Aaron Fern. They are a team that had an incredible year last year in the American. Charlotte at 3-1. The loss at Utah State at 103-74 is look, it's a tough loss. Utah State 49th in Ken Palm. They beat Presbyterian, beat Richmond, and beat Gardner Webb 60-54. That's a team we'll get to very shortly. It's a tough team there in Gardner Webb. LIU, East Tennessee State, non D1. Then they play Davidson as well. The Cross Charlotte rivalry there. Davidson's projected to win by 4, according to Ken Palm. So that should be a really good game. And then they play a couple of tough, road contests, including at Hawaii before they play their American schedule. Charlotte is a team recently, like I said, with Fern, I think is building something. I'm not necessarily sold on them this year as much as I am in the future, and just what I believe in the program with Fern. But they've got Nick Graves, who's a really great player for them, and it's just a team that they're going to have to find their identity defensively. That's where they've struggled so far early on. But I think if they can figure that out, the American, I think, is as relatively wide open as ever, with some really great teams, as always, being competitive, and some teams that are getting better, like I mentioned earlier, your East Carolinas and Charlotte should be at least a tough out throughout the conference schedule. Number 10, I mentioned Gardner Webb. Gardner Webb being the 10th best team in the state of North Carolina is probably not something you expected to hear, but it's early. They've played a handful of games. They've beaten Elon and North Carolina Central, 2 in-state teams, which, of course, I have them ahead of those 2. And then I have them behind a team in state that they lost to in Charlotte, like I mentioned. And then they've covered it the first 3 games of the season. They covered all of them, actually. So far, they're 5-0 against the spread: Tennessee, North Carolina Central, Pittsburgh, Elon, and Charlotte. So that's an impressive feat for a team of Gardner Webb. I really like Coach Luther. I like his energy. It's been really infectious for this team early on. They almost beat Charlotte on the road, true road game. Look, Gardner Webb is not going to blow people away in the non-con. Obviously, the win against Elon's huge. The win against North Dakota Central is huge for them. Going on the road to Tennessee and being competitive is a win right there, and covering, like I said, Pittsburgh, again, covering. But just overall, these wins or these close results, for the most part, are going to be a really big building block for Gardner Webb, who I underestimated in the magazine, in the ECB magazine coming into the season. But I think that they're only going to get better. I think they're going to only continue to build upon this. They play Belmont, Wofford, North Carolina Central again, which is interesting. I didn't know that. Queens, Georgia Southern, East Carolina, Charleston Southern. So they're going to be able to string together some wins here. And then I think they're going to be one of the most competitive teams in the entire Big South. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch and see how we kind of understand the top is High Point, Winthrop, and everyone else below that. I think they can be really competitive. I'm not sure it's a third place team. I think there's some other ones in there. Longwood's going to be really good. I think Radford's better than people think early on. UNC Asheville, you can't count them out, despite where I have them in this ranking. But Gardner Webb, a team I'm really excited about, 2 and 3 so far. They can string together some wins here if the Belmont Wofford games go their way. They're able to come out against like a Queens later on in the month of December. I think they can be really fun, like I said, and into Big South play. Number 11, I have the team that I'm most familiar with because of game coverage and because of geolocation. It's the Campbell Fighting Camels. Look, this is kind of where I draw the line of tier of team that I think is a lot better than maybe where they are so far. At 11, Campbell has played an interesting schedule, and this schedule only gets harder as they head. As their next game will be on Friday against Ohio State at Ohio State as part of like an MTE little tournament there. They play Evansville. They play Green Bay as well. But they beat a non-D1 twice, and then they lost on the road at Virginia. Albeit, I know Virginia, Tony Bennett leaving a few weeks before the season. I understand things are different. They've got a couple of freshmen in there. A couple of guys decided to transfer. I still think this is a competitive Virginia team. It was still a true road game on a Wednesday night. And they played that game really close. At one point, it was, I think, within 6 at the under 8 timeout or somewhere in that range. They were under 10 for most of the game, 65-56 on the road there. St. Francis is a tough loss, 339 in Ken Palm for St. Francis. This is a team that, last year went up to St. Francis in the home and home and lost by 2. And Cam Gregory, you think, okay, bring the best player from St. Francis down to Blues Creek. maybe that's a huge difference maker. Just couldn't make shots, couldn't couldn't control the turnovers. But ultimately, the win against Navy, good building block win. Navy isn't going to be one of the better teams in the Patriot League, that's for sure. Ohio State 22nd in Ken Palm. Evansville is a winnable game. Green Bay is a winnable game. Then they return home, Coastal Carolina at the Citadel, at Morgan State, home against Longwood, and a former Big South rival there. North Carolina. These are all games I'll be at for the most part. Obviously, some of the road games far out I won't be, but this is a team I really like. Like I said it in the magazine, I picked them fourth to finish in the CAA. I think there's a clear top team. I think I'm wrong with Hofstra. That's probably the fourth best team in the CAA, and probably will continue to be. Or they may be better than that at this rate. But there's a team that makes their free throws are top 10 in the country in free throw percentage. They force steals. They take care of the ball so far early on. That's something that's been really impressive for them. And they're starting to figure themselves out on offense. I think it'll be a team that comes together here. They'll learn a lot about themselves on this road stretch here. Next, I have UNC Greensboro. UNC Greensboro in the last couple of years has been a really competitive team with the Langley brothers. Unfortunately, those guys are no longer part of the program. They've since moved on. But Donovan Atwell was one of the best players in the SoCon. He'll be a really effective piece for them this year. They've only played 3 games. They lost a relatively close one at SMU. They beat Florida Gulf Coast, and then they beat a non-D1. They play at Indiana on Thursday, November 21st. Should be a really interesting game there. Long Beach State, San Jose State, UTEP are some teams that I think they can beat. High Point's a really tough game. They play High Point at home. True home game for them on December 3rd. They play A&T. As always, that's a fun game. Never know how that one's going to go. They're projected to win by 1, according to KenPom. This is a team that's a really stout defensive team so far. Right? They're third in blocks in KenPom. And at the end of the day, UNC Greensboro definitely has lost some integral pieces to their team. Mikael Brown-Jones is now at Ole Miss. He's going to be an incredible piece for them in the SEC. But at the end of the day, UNC Greensboro, they're going to have some games that they can win. They're going to be confident heading into conference play. I do think that they're not one of the top tier teams in the SoCon, but the SoCon being one of the better teams at the top or leagues at the top here recently. Look, I'm never going to count them out. I think Mike Jones is one of the best coaches in the country at that level, and I think he'll continue to find and stretch more out of guys like Keon Giles and Ronald Polite. I think he'll be able to just milk every bit of talent out of those guys. I think they'll be really competitive heading into the SoCon. 13, I have Elon, a team that I'm honestly surprised by. I'm absolutely surprised by Elon at 2-2. They've won in North Carolina, gave them a tough game. They had it beat a non-D1. They lost by 1 to Gardner Webb at Gardner Webb, and then they just beat Northern Illinois on Wednesday night. This is a team that I think coming into the year with an identity of playing zone, shooting a lot of threes. It didn't work out for them last year. But Billy Taylor, only been there a handful of years now. With the Simpkin brothers bringing in the other Simpkin brother from the non-Division I level, I think it's a dynamic backcourt. It's a dynamic duo that they can build around. Sam Sherry is one of the best big men in the conference. Nick Dorn, I think, is a really great player who can shoot from deep. It's those guys at that, KenPom calls them role player, limited role players further down the bench. If those guys are going to be consistent contributors and be really deep, guys like Matthew Van Komen, Jamil Rideout, somebody I think can be really good for them, Andrew King. If those guys can play and play a lot and play well, I think Elon, it starts to look different as a team. They've just, are they going to stick to the identity? Are they going to continue to be the same zone 3, not change up, make a bunch of adjustments and just stick to what they're good at? A la Syracuse in the past there. They've been a great defensive team so far. They are 9th in 2-point defense in the country, holding their opponents to 37.9% from that area. That's impressive. And no matter how you cut it there, I really like the Simpkin brothers, and I think it'd be really fun to watch those guys play together. 14, I have App State. App State was one of the teams ravaged by the transfer portal. They lost a lot of key pieces in the offseason, but Dustin Kearns is one of the best coaches in the country. Don't care. I'll continue to stick to that. And with App State, when you come off a season where you're probably one of the, obviously they lost to, they ultimately lost in the SoCon the SoCon semis to Arkansas State. But at the end of the day, if you're able to even bring back a guy like Miles Tate, CJ Huntley, like these are guys that are great building block pieces for a year when you return basically nothing. You lose Spillers, obviously, to Wake Forest. We talked about him earlier. They lost to Miami, Ohio to start the season in the Sun Belt MAC Challenge. That's a game that they probably could have won, probably should have won, according to KenPom. They beat a non-D1. They go to Wisconsin and get killed, and then they beat Queens. It's a in-state game that they can build upon. 3-point defense is always going to be really good under Kearns. The offensive struggles, I think, is going to continue to hurt them. They'll have to figure that out. They're just, right now they're actually not making their free throws. They're almost dead last in free throw percentage. That's obviously not going to continue, and I don't anticipate that staying that low. They got to figure themselves out offensively. I know when you lose that much production, it's a really tall task, especially when you're playing some tough teams early on. They play William & Mary, Sam Houston State, Colgate, UNC Wilmington. That's probably one of the hardest stretches there they'll have all year, including some of their Sun Belt games. That is part of that UNC Wilmington MT we talked about earlier. They'll get to play all three of those teams in that tournament. 15th, we have NC Central. What Coach Moten has done there and how well he's kind of coached that program up in their history. Look, they're always going to be competitive. I know that their record doesn't show that, and I know I'm ranking a 1-5 team ahead of some teams behind them. But I maybe could have swapped 15-16 here in just a minute. But Central's played some tough games. They played George Mason pretty hard. Gardner Webb, they lost by 6. High Point, albeit it's High Point. It's on the road. It's a 16-point loss. That's a tough game. Georgia Southern lost by 5. They beat William & Mary, who people projected to be like the 6th best team in the CAA this year. And like this massive turnaround in year one under Coach Earl, I'm not, I definitely was not in that camp coming into the year. To beat William & Mary on a neutral court, that's an impressive feat. Winthrop, that game was, as Brian Wilmer put it, just bananas, and just how some of the calls kind of got out of hand there. 77-75. That was part of that little Winthrop Rock Hill Classic or whatever they call that tournament now. And they play Georgia State coming up, 2 non-D1s to get themselves figured out. Radford, Gardner Webb, a lot of big South teams this year for them. West Virginia on the road, true road game there. And then they'll get a nice stretch at home to open up MEAC play in a couple of weeks after that. But they're always going to be good under Moten. Obviously, the start of the season, 1-5, that's how most of these MEAC teams do, because they just play these ridiculously hard schedules that earn them a lot of money. Obviously, that's a big part of how this scheduling game works, right? You figure out who's going to pay you, how far you're going to travel, and you just figure it out. And these teams, they normally learn a lot about themselves, and they normally come home and it's a building block. It's the reason Howard's been so good. Howard scheduled these incredible games against Kansas and whoever the heck else. Central does the same thing. I think it really helps them. I think it's a building block for these teams later on in conference play, because then the MEAC teams aren't going to look hard. They're going to have an identity. They're going to be tough to play, and they'll be well tested by that point. Moving on, we'll get out of here soon. Queens is going to be our number 16 spot. Queens and Grant Leonard, a guy that I've known a couple of years now, who's building an incredible, I don't call it resume, but just building an incredible program down there, coming up from the lower levels of Division II, and taking this team gracefully through their transition to Division I and being able to play in the NCAA tournament potentially here in just 2 years. And just what they've been able to do has been impressive. Once they get into ASUN play, they're a team that likes to play fast. They lost a lot of great players to the transfer portal who I think are going to be standouts all throughout the country. They beat a non-D1 to open the year, beat Western Carolina. I know Western Carolina hasn't been mentioned yet, which is why Queens is ahead of them. Utah, they got destroyed. BYU, they got destroyed, and then they lost on the road at App State. It's a game that they could have won, 64-53. Credit to App's defense. I mentioned earlier, App's an incredible defensive team. Offensively, there's a reason this game was in the 60s. Queens 335th in offense. That is not like them. That is not characteristic to who they've been recently. Playing really fast, hitting a lot of threes. And I think this young group and this young core of guards with Anderson and Pollard and Bryce Cash and Chris Ashby, I think these guys, as they figure themselves out and as they figure out how to play together, they'll continue to get into that groove offensively. They're not hitting the three well right now. They'll figure that out. That the offensive production is the least of my concerns. A guy I'm really excited about for them, just from a defensive standpoint, kind of changing who they are a little bit. Malcolm Wilson, I had him picked as the ASUN Defensive Player of the Year, and I don't expect that to change. I think he'll be really good this year, and he's had some incredible performances to start the season. Next, we have Western Carolina and first-year head coach Justin Gray. Western Carolina, obviously coming off the best season in program history last year. They play a non-D1 to open the season. They lose to Queens. They beat a non-D1. So they've only beaten only two of their four games, and only 2 wins have come against non-Division I opponents. Wake Forest, of course, that's always a fun game when you get to play an ACC team. It's 82-69. Game's a lot closer than I think a lot of people anticipated. Their offense is not anything to be, excited about just yet. Plucked over some guys from Western Carolina coming over with Coach Gray. Bernard Pelote, somebody that I think is going to continue to be better for them as the year goes on. Brandon Morgan, I think, is a guy to watch as a guy that gets more comfortable. CJ Highland's a really great freshman that they have. Their schedule's tough. Like it just is. They play Queens. So I know 302nd and Kent Palm, but that's a tough Queens team. We talked about Wake, Marquette, Bellarmine, USC Upstate, UNC Asheville, Tennessee. This is all before they play anybody in the SoCon. And then they open with Furman, Sanford, Wofford, Mercer, VMI, UNC Greensboro. These are all really hard SoCon games. I'm not saying Western is going to have the greatest season in the world. I mentioned, slipped up earlier, Justin Gray left to go to Coastal. Tim Kraft, his first year head coach, I meant to mention earlier, But either way, a lot of stuff still stands there with the same players, just not where they came from. Tim Kraft, great coach at Gardner Webb. I think this is a nice position for him to be in and be able to build a program like he did at Gardner Webb. All of the same sentiments about the players and how they play completely is the same. Number 18, North Carolina A&T. I think this will be the only time they'll be this low all season. They're obviously a CAA team that returned a lot of production. They returned basically every single valuable piece from their last year. Landon Glasper, who was top scorer in the conference in CAA. A couple of great big men there. Nicholas, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name. I'd do him, no justice there. Jalal McKee is a great player. Cammy and Shell, Will Felton. This is a deep team. They're a lot better than they were last year, just from a production standpoint already early on. I know they're 3-2. They beat a non-D1. Played Wake. That game's always tough. Lost to George Washington on the road. True road game. 3 in a row here. They won at the Citadel. They won home against Morgan State. They play Buffalo, ECU, Hampton, UNC Greensboro, Virginia Tech, Liberty. These are all games that they can win if they start to click offensively. It's just same old for all these teams at the bottom. I keep talking about where if their offensive production can get going early on, they'll really be able to get into a stride as they head into conference play. And I think A&T, a team that people projected to be better, not a drastic improvement over last year. When you're the most continuity-rich team, arguably in the CAA, there's been quite a couple there. But they returned 2 of the best guards in the conference. Like it's a building block that you're always going to be able to be excited about. And again, I say it all the time. I've said it a lot today in this podcast. These games help you build as a program. These games help you build on the season and learn what you have and learn what to improve upon so that you're battle tested for a conference like the CAA. And I think they'll be really good. They got to figure themselves out offensively. And I believe in Monty Ross to do that. Lastly, it hurts my heart. UNC Asheville, obviously, with all of the unfortunate events that have happened in recent, weeks here. Now it's only been a few weeks, right? It happened in the middle of October. Have not played a true home game yet, unfortunately for UNC Asheville. Away at Alabama, that's a loss. Loss at Ohio, a game that they played really, really good for their second game of the year. Ohio is going to be one of the best teams in the MAC, one of the best teams in mid-major basketball. And they only lost that 82-76. And then at North Florida, who was the story and the darling of the first week, beating a couple of really good teams in North Florida. North Florida defeated South Carolina, Charleston Southern, and Georgia Tech to go 3-0 to start the season. I mean, just a ridiculous story there. And UNC Asheville beats them at their place, neutral against Southeast Missouri, and then they don't return home after Central Arkansas, Tennessee State, George Mason, and they finally return home on Saturday, December 7th against St. Andrews, a non-D1 opponent. They'll also play Western Carolina, UNCW. So they've got a High Point, Longwood. They obviously have a ridiculous in-state schedule there. Look, they've overcome adversity. I think if there's anything that's going to help a team get better, it's going to be big wins early on in the year when a lot of people are going to doubt you early on after no longer having Drew Pember, who's best player in program history, bar none. This is a team that, as they figuring themselves out, Jordan Marsh, Josh Banks, Toyas Sullivan, all really, really incredible guards. That group is just going to be one of the most battle-tested groups, despite not playing, some of these guys not playing with each other for a really long time. That's a credit to Mike Morrell and keeping this team rallied, keeping this community rallied. They don't have a football program, so they really believe in this basketball team. They buy in to everything that this program has done and built and won. And at the end of the day, look, beating North Florida on the road, that's a humongous win, right? It's not obviously going to fix anything that's happened, but they're a great offensive team, as always. They take care of the ball, too. They're top 40 in KenPom and turnover percentage offensively, so they take care of the ball. They know what they're doing. Coach Morrell trusts these experienced guards, and I think that's only going to help them and make them better as the season goes on, as they go into Big South play with some of the best teams in the country when it comes to guards at the mid-major, low-major level. They'll be one of the best teams in that conference. Once again, I don't see them slipping, even with the loss of Pember. They've got some really good talent on this team. And again, I believe in Morrell. I believe in them being able to just figure things out. I know they went through a lot of adversity, arguably the most adversity in the entire country, and that's only going to help them be better. So 19th is kind of a far cry to where I think they can be, but so far to start the year, you lose to Alabama, you lose to Ohio, and you have one of your best wins in North Florida. There was just enough from some of the teams ahead of them that somebody had to be last, and unfortunately, it's UNC Asheville, but they'll be back. All right. That has been a really great segment here with the NC D1 Power Rankings, and that is going to be it for the podcast today. We'll have some NBA content coming here soon. At the end of the day, getting back into things with the podcasts. I appreciate all the love and support on the post I put out the other day with 10,000 downloads. This podcast has only been a thing for coming up on, I believe, 4 years it would be. Yep. So December 2020. And I'm everything under the sun, whatever adjective you want to put here, grateful, blessed. Thank you. Thank you so much for the continued support on this podcast and everything that you guys do. Like, comment, subscribe, listening to me talk by myself into a mic. We'll have some guests on here soon, but I'm eternally grateful for the 10,000 downloads. Continue to like, comment, and subscribe. Greatly appreciate all the support. From the bottom of my heart, this has been the 2 Pointers Podcast. I'm Trevor Everett. We will see you in the next one.